together the university and the tertiary sector with the business community with a view to obtaining interaction between them, in large part to assist tertiary institutions in coping with that change. The theme of tonight's lecture is therefore particularly apposite. I have the opportunity of saying sometimes a few words about speakers, and on the occasion of this evening there's one I just have to mention, and that is that we're in the comparatively unusual position in introducing a lecturer, in that the person concerned is in fact a Monash graduate. Us Monash graduates are a comparatively youthful lot and tend to be reaching the stages in careers in which they are being invited before distinguished audiences such as this, and it's a great pleasure to have a Monash graduate presenting a lecture as part of the Monash Law School Foundation series. Many of these lectures, and most of them, are given in collaboration with business organisations and with firms of solicitors, and the firm with which we've had particularly close contact in this series has been the firm of Cause Chambers Westgarth. They have been extremely generous to us in providing premises and in seeing to organisation for us, have done an excellent job, and we are extremely grateful to them for their continued assistance to the law faculty and the university, and for their participation in this series, and for the excellent job they have done in organising all the lectures as part of this series. Final thank you is to Terry Macfarlane, Associate Editor of the Herald Sun, who has very kindly come along to introduce Ian Macfarlane to you, and without more I'll ask Terry to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. It certainly gives me immense pleasure to be asked to perform this function this afternoon. For the first reason being that I'm not required to speak and to field your questions, and looking at some of the people in the audience today, they might be quite pointed, as Bob has indicated, it's the most apposite time to be delivering the lecture that our speaker is. But secondly, and more to the point, I'm going to be very gratified, as I think all of you will be, to listen to what Ian has got to say. I've found over the years that Ian has always been very frank and open in his comments and his dealings with the media and the public more generally. And he's done so in the last year or so from what I regard as quite an extraordinarily difficult position, that is of a deputy. A deputy in any situation is always a difficult role to play. You tend to be caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. And although Bernie Fraser might be quite a nice devil, it still can leave you in a rather difficult position. Ian, I think, has shown remarkable timing over the years. As Bob indicated, he graduated from Monash in the mid-60s, which was a good time to be at Monash in its exciting days, both on and off campus. And then he had the good sense to spend most of the 70s outside Australia, which I think gave him an interesting perspective on how the real world worked, primarily at Oxford and working for the OECD. At the end of the 70s, since then, and he's held a number of positions in that time at the Reserve Bank. He worked for 5 years in the money, bond and foreign exchange market areas of the Reserve Bank, became Assistant Governor Economic, and more recently, and is now the Deputy Governor. Before asking you to get up to speak, I might say that unfortunately I'm going to have to leave, and I don't want anyone to see that as an editorial comment on what Ian's got to say, but I might have to slip out now. I'm sure we're all been waiting to hear what Ian's got to say on this most relevant topic of making monetary policy in a most uncertain world.
Thank you very much, Terry. I'd like to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here today, speaking to you at this function organised by the Monash University Law School and sponsored by Cause. It's very nice to be able to do something of use to my old university, even if I have not been able to do it to my old faculty. My talk today will be in 4 parts. The first part will be to say something about what's happening in the rest of the world, the international environment. to make us realise that we're not as unique as we think we are. The second and the third parts will cover aspects of the recent cyclical experience, in particular two aspects that make this episode rather different to other recessions. And the final part will deal with what I think monetary policy has been attempting to do over the last few years. Now, if we start with the world environment, it's worth remembering a few old verities. No country has eliminated the business cycle. The cycles are less pronounced than they were before the Second World War, but within the post-war period there hasn't been any tendency for them to become any smaller. There is still a high correlation between the timing of each country's business cycle, so that the world economy, and particularly the OECD area, exhibits a clear business cycle. The cycle is familiar to many people, and I'm sure there are a lot in this room would have no difficulty in identifying the three world recessions of the last quarter of a century. They were in approximately 1974, 1982 and 1991. Not surprisingly, Australia's cyclical experience is very similar. Now, one of the things that we were accustomed to thinking about the present world downturn was that it was a mild one compared to its predecessors, but this isn't so. I think we still have the earlier forecasts in our mind, and they certainly pointed to a relatively mild downturn in the world economy, but as the figures have come in, they have been a lot weaker than the forecasts. And I think now, when you look back at 1991, you can see that the downturn has been virtually of the same severity as the previous two major downturns. I'm going to, in the process of this, I want to make some reference to the copy of the talk that you've got, and there are a few diagrams and tables in there which I'll refer to. So for those who've got a copy of it, if you look at diagram 1 on page 2, you'll see what I mean. The growth in the OECD area in 1991 has now been revised down to being 0.5%, which is not a lot different to what it was in 74 and 82. And if you look at the world economy, if you look at the IMF estimates for the world economy rather than just the OECD or developed economy, you can see that the growth in 1991 was in fact the weakest year in the last quarter of a century. And part of this is, of course, due to developments in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, where output fell by about 10% last year. So that's something that it's actually reasonably similar this time around, although most of us haven't adjusted to the fact that it is reasonably similar. The factor that's different this time has been the importance in a number of economies of the fact that the recession followed a period where there had been a lot of expansion of debt and large rise in asset prices. And by and large, the economies that went into recession first were the ones that were most characterised by this process. For example, the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the Scandinavian countries. Continental Europe held up best, in part because of its lack of financial excess and also because it received a boost from a fiscal boost from German unification. Again, if we refer to the speech, the copy you've got, and look at table 1, which is on page 3, you can get an idea on the second column there. You can get an idea of how large downturns have been from peak to trough in, it's not the whole OECD area there, but it's the 15 countries for which I could get timely quarterly data. Some of the ones at the bottom, there hasn't been any downturn, but the 10 at the top, there has been a cyclical contraction or a recession, or if you want to call it. And the 5 at the bottom, there hasn't. I should hasten to add that this is only the scorecard as of now. when the whole thing has sorted its way out, it may look rather different, and there may be a few others added to the bottom of that list. Now, if we turn to world inflation, I've talked about world output. If we turn to world inflation, there are a couple of interesting developments which I think are worth pointing out. The first one is that there has recently been a convergence of inflation rates among OECD countries. In other words, when I say convergence, the rates of inflation are more similar than they were in some earlier periods. I'm going to illustrate that with diagram 2, which is on page 4. That diagram actually shows, it's not the level of inflation, it shows the variability of inflation. And it shows something which is not surprising, that in the early period before about 1973, there was a relatively low variability. Countries had similar inflation rates. It's a period of fixed exchange rates. When we moved to a world of floating exchange rates, each country had the opportunity to run its own exchange rate regime and run its own rate of inflation, and they proceeded to do so, and so the variability of inflation amongst countries jumped up, and in fact it jumped by a factor of 2 or 3 there, and it stayed quite high. But recently we are now seeing the variability reduce again as countries are converging on a similar rate of inflation. And this is happening, I think, essentially because the high inflation, quote unquote, countries have come back into the fold by substantially reducing their core rates of inflation. They have found that running inflation rates noticeably higher than the OECD average, even if the rates are still in single digits, is not a viable long-run proposition. On the other hand, the low inflation countries have to date tended to have had normal business cycles in the sense that a bit in, but then in the contraction it came down, but it didn't actually necessarily come down to any lower than it had been in the second half of the 80s. So what we have seen mainly is the high inflation countries stopping being high inflation countries and coming down to join the majority of the OECD area. Now, who are these, or who were these high inflation countries? Who were the outliers? I attempt to demonstrate that using diagram 3 on page 5. Now, this is a little bit more complicated than the other one, so I'll have to spend a minute or two explaining it. The horizontal axis just shows the average rate of inflation during the 80s. Now, the vertical axis tries to measure something that's similar, but it tries to measure the extent to which each country reduced its inflation in the 80s compared with the 70s. Now, all countries there, all those 15 countries, in fact, did have lower inflation in the 80s than in the 70s, but by differing degrees. So the bigger the reduction, the lower the reading will be on the vertical axis. So success in achieving low inflation would show up as a reading on that graph near in the bottom left-hand corner. On the other hand, if only modest improvement was made in inflation, and it was still high by OECD standards in the 80s, the reading would be near the top right-hand corner. Well, on this basis, the successful countries over the last 10 years have been the Netherlands, in order, Japan, plus Germany and 2 of its satellites, the Netherlands and Austria. At the other end of the scale, the countries that had the least success in reducing inflation were New Zealand, Sweden, Australia and Norway. That's in the descending order of what their average inflation rates were in the 80s. Now, I should hasten to remind people that this is a decade by decade comparison, so it does not give very much weight to very recent developments. The whole graph is based on the average of the 80s compared to the average of the 70s. Now, if we were to look at the very recent period, of course, we would get almost exactly the opposite result. If we looked at those 4 countries, which are out there, the top right-hand corner, for having had the least success in reducing inflation, but looked at them now over the last year, you would see that the rates of inflation are For New Zealand, 1%. This is increases in CPI over the last 12 months, 1%. Sweden, 1.8%. Australia, 1.2%. And Norway, 2.5%. So there has been a remarkable change there. And if I wanted to extend it, I could add a few other countries onto that list. The Canadians have had a very big reduction. Even some of the ones, the European countries that have joined the exchange rate mechanism, Italy and Spain, Ireland, traditionally very high inflation countries, have reduced their inflation rate substantially. Now that was the first of my four subjects. Now can I turn to the second one? The second and third one are domestic issues. They're things that are happening in the Australian economy which make this cycle different to previous ones. And the first one I want to refer to, I have called Economising on Labour for Productivity Improvement, because I couldn't think of a better title. It's something that's been happening for a number of years, and it's obviously speeded up over the last 2 years. And I refer to the practice could be variously termed labour shedding, economising on labour, reducing staffing levels, or in its most favourable form, productivity improvement. Now, it's been happening, and there's no question about that. It's been happening for quite a while. And obviously, a lot of it, particularly the timing of it, is a result of the recession. But I think a significant part of it is also structural in nature. It's the result of the country realising that whatever goods and services we produce, we should aim to do so at world best practice. We've talked about this for ages, and in fact, I believe we've been acting on it for longer than we realise. Now, it's very difficult to quantify this, and so I'm not going to try and do so. You'd have to do it from individual enterprise data. Now, just because I can't quantify it, I don't think, or others have difficulty quantifying, I don't think they dispute that it's been happening. And I think it is well summarised by a recent comment on it by Alan Kohler, the business journalist, and I'll quote. He says, "For 3 years, Australian businesses have been obsessed with cutting costs for 2 reasons: because sales volumes collapsed with recession, and because of the unanimous consensus among opinion leaders in the government, business and unions that the nation must become more internationally competitive. The federal government has been forcing industry to cut costs through lower tariffs, plus whatever other pressures it can bring to bear. The ringing message from Canberra, government and opposition, politicians and bureaucrats alike, has been that business must cut costs and become more competitive." He goes on to say, "If anything, the additional pressure on company directors from the marketplace has been even greater. Institutional shareholders have made their views on bloated costs crystal clear in word and action. The stock market has been merciless on companies that did not regularly report continuing reductions in manning levels over the past 3 years. The chief executives of dozens of leading companies have been pushed aside and replaced by people better able to make the hard decisions." I'm quoting this because it's easier to quote it than, as I said, to come up with some objective measure which is good enough to publish. If I can add a few other pieces of evidence to what I quoted there, I think all of us are probably familiar with companies that have, probably for the first times in their histories, in some cases even very conservative companies that have been around for 100 years or so, for the first time really announcing significant programs of staff reductions. And it's not only occurring in industries where turnover has fallen, it is also happening more widely than that. For 2 examples that spring to mind for me are, for example, insurance superannuation and retail banking. There's no suggestion that turnover has been reduced in either of those 2 areas, but they are certainly making significant reductions in staffing levels. And I think even more importantly, it's also happening in public utilities. I'm not saying that it's happening in government general, but it's certainly in government in general, but it's certainly happening in public utilities. There was a recent EPAC report on 38 government business enterprises, which showed that they had made a reduction in staffing levels of 34,000 people over the last 2 years, even though their output increased. Now, in the case of a government enterprise, they certainly would have been under no direct pressure to do so because of the recession. The decisions they made would have been based entirely on productivity considerations. These developments will probably continue to happen for some time to come. Their short-term consequences for employment are very unfortunate, but I doubt that we could or should try and turn the clock back. They are an essential component of any attempt to solve the nation's medium-term problem of sustainable growth in a competitive world. The alternative of thinking that we could insulate ourselves from the world in order to preserve archaic management and industrial practices is not viable. There's no reason why it should take more Australians to manage a bank or load a ship than it takes in other countries to do the same thing. I think we have to accept that. It's something that we have to do, and we'll probably have to do for quite a while to come. It's probably something we should have started doing a lot earlier, but at the same time we have to recognise that it has been happening, and it's one of the things that makes this particular cycle, or this particular 3 or 4 or 5 years, look different to what otherwise might have seemed like similar cycles 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Now, the third thing I want to mention, which is related in a way, in that it's something that's happened that it makes this cycle look different to previous ones, is regional disparities. Australia has traditionally had relatively small economic disparities among states compared to, for example, with Canada or the US. It's both federations, but also we've probably had smaller disparities than there have been in regions of countries with a unitary government. And in cyclical terms, the same thing applies, that in past cycles they have tended to hit each region or each state in a similar way. Now, on this occasion it's been different, and I don't have to remind the audience here that Victoria has had a deeper recession than the rest of Australia, and although Tasmania and South Australia have shared some of the experiences of Victoria, this has made this a very unusual recession and made it very difficult for economic forecasters, and I suspect for policymakers. Now again, I illustrate this in the speech via a table, which is on a very small table. This one, it's only got 4 numbers in it, which is on page 8. It shows the fall in employment in Victoria and in the rest of Australia in two recessions, the one in the early 80s and the one in 1991. In the recession of the early 80s, the fall in employment was virtually the same in Victoria and in other states, but in the recent recession, the fall in employment is nearly 3 times as large in Victoria as in the rest of Australia. I suppose the other thing that you can conclude from this is that in terms of employment at least, the recent recession is a good deal deeper than the early 80s one in Victoria, but somewhat milder than the early 80s one for the rest of Australia. Obviously there are some forces at work on a regional basis that have given us this uneven outcome, and I don't propose to speculate on them at this stage, other than to say that the uneven outcome could not be the result of nationally operating policies. For example, to bring it closer to home, the tight monetary policy that was necessary in the late 80s has obviously played a role in the recent contraction in output and employment, but is only part of the story. The same monetary policy operated in each state, so it cannot explain why employment would fall by 7% in one and by 2% in others. Whilst I'm on this general area, I think I would also like to come to the defence of another nationally operating policy, which is trade policy. There's been a tendency to blame tariff reductions for the severity of the downturn in Victoria, and also a tendency to do it in South Australia. But I'm sceptical of this explanation for several reasons. I suppose the most important one is that if you look at the structure of employment there's not as big a difference between states as you think in terms of where people work. For example, 20.5% of the Victorian employment is in manufacturing. For the rest of the country, it's 15.7. It's not a huge disparity between 20.5 and 15.5. And if you look at what's happened to manufacturing employment throughout Australia, you see that indeed it has declined, and indeed it has declined faster than a lot of other areas, but it's by no means the fastest declines. But the decline has been very similar in most regions. So the decline in manufacturing employment in Victoria was 11%. The decline in manufacturing employment in the rest of Australia was about 11%. So on the most generous assumptions, I find that you can probably explain about 0.3 of 1% of the extra fall in employment in Victoria by its larger exposure to the manufacturing sector. So that's a very small amount. We're saying that employment fell by 4.7 percentage points more. Of that 4.7, you might be able to explain about 0.3. Obviously, it would be nicer if we could explain things simply, but the story is usually a lot more complicated than that. It's human nature to want to put things into convenient and familiar boxes, but the simple explanations often let us down. This last observation brings me to the role of monetary policy in reducing inflation in Australia. In our annual report, which we released last week, and which doesn't tend to get read very in much detail because it gets swamped by the budget, which was released 2 days earlier. But in this annual report, we pointed out, as we did in the annual report that we put out in 1990 and the one we put out in 1991, that monetary policy in this cycle has adopted a more medium-term anti-inflationary focus than formerly. Now, it's a difficult story to tell because it's really a story about a change in emphasis rather than the abandonment of one policy and the wholehearted embrace of a totally different one. And that is always a difficult story to get over, but there's no reason why we shouldn't continue to talk about it. Whether we have as much success as we would like is a different matter. People tend to want to hear a very simple story. They tend to want to be able to put the story into a convenient box, label it, and there are a couple of convenient boxes that people have put monetary policy into over the last few years, last 2 or 3 years. There are a number of skeptics who doubt that there's been any change in approach at all. There are people who feel that what monetary policy is about is simply smoothing the cycle. If the economy is running too fast, you tighten it. If it's running too slowly, you loosen it. They think that's what monetary policy is about. That's all there is to it. They don't think that there's really been any change, that that's obviously what we're trying to do, but we didn't succeed. And therefore, on this view, if that's what you're trying to do, any fall in inflation must just be an accident. And at the other extreme, there are those who believe that there has been a change and in fact probably take it extremely literally and feel that monetary policy has changed so much that it concentrates entirely on reducing inflation and is oblivious to any other economic variables. Now, I realise that both of these two are caricatures, but I think I have heard people putting forward views that are very similar to those caricatures, and besides, it makes it easy for me in arguing against those caricatures to perhaps put forward some views which I think will get us closer to where the truth lies. Well, let's start with the first caricature that says that nothing has changed. I think that monetary policy has a clearer anti-inflationary focus is beyond doubt. We have put a lot of effort into trying to get our views on this across. We've put out numerous articles, speeches, reports highlighting the costs of inflation and the opportunities available for a return to low inflation. The phrase that was coined in early 1990 was a once in a decade opportunity. It may well actually have been a once in a two-decade opportunity, because if we do actually move to sustainably lower inflation, it will have taken 2 decades to get back to where we started. Now, as well as pointing out these general views, there have been a number of changes to the way in which monetary policy is conducted. The first one is it's now a lot more transparent, in that when a policy change is made, the instrument of monetary policy, which is the cash rate, is moved by a discrete amount. Discrete being spelt D-I-S-C-R-E-T-E as opposed to double E-T, and it is announced the moment it is made. That's the first change. The second change is that when a monetary policy change occurs, it almost always follows a Reserve Bank board meeting. Occasionally, decisions made at the board meeting are contingent on the receipt of data confirming some expected economic outcome, in which case the change will occur upon the receipt of that data. Third change is that when we do make a change, it is accompanied by a press release spelling out the reasons for the decision. If you go back and look over those press releases, you'll find that the factors that are most often behind the change, this is the period since 1990 when interest rates have been going down, when we felt we were in a position to ease. The most frequently cited reasons are developments in the current and prospective rate of inflation, inflationary expectations, and the level of domestic activity. The fourth difference is that the pace of reductions in cash rates has been measured, and markets have had the opportunity to absorb each change. While the bank has not been in awe of the market's judgment, it has been conscious that too large a movement could trigger damaging consequences in the foreign exchange and bond markets. We obviously sought to avoid such counterproductive reactions which could raise inflation and conceivably weaken activity at the same time. Now, in summary, the change in focus and in operations has avoided panic moves or about turns. The maximum that the bill rate fell in any one month was about 1 percentage point. If you went back to, for example, 1982, the last time there was a cyclical phase that had some similarities to this, there were months when the bill rate fell by 3 and 4 percentage points. At no stage during this downward phase of this cycle was there an attempt to turn all the guns around and focus only on propping up the economy at the expense of the medium-term objectives. In our view, this would probably have risked us ending up with the worst of all possible worlds, which is forfeiting the gains on inflation and at most achieving a negligible softening in or reduction in the size of the downturn. Now, I'll get on to the other, what I call the other extreme proposition, that monetary policy was only interested in maximising the fall in inflation regardless of the costs. On this view of the world, the economy would still be moving ahead smoothly were it not for a misguided application of tight monetary policy. Like its predecessor, I've set this up as a caricature because in answering it I think there are some useful points that can be picked up. The first one, of course, is the economy was not smoothly moving ahead in the mid and late 80s. It was under some extreme pressures, most notably the debt build-up and asset price boom, and towards the end of the decade it was also under the pressure of unsustainably strong domestic demand. The tensions were only kept from bursting out by the application of very high real interest rates for most of the decade. It's a mistake to concentrate on the high interest rates of 1989. The whole decade was characterised by high interest rates. Bill and bond rates, for example, reached higher levels in 1982 and 1985 than they did in 1989. That's the first point. where we started wasn't all that good. The second point is, having seen the experience of other countries in similar circumstances to Australia over recent years, some of which subsequently had deeper recessions than Australia, which is shown on table 1 in the paper, could we really have expected to avoid a recession altogether? I think the answer is no, although I concede that it is a point that will never be proved. But I think the challenge for policy was really to see how we could come out of the recession. Could we come out of it with some permanent improvement in some fundamental economic variables? Now, at the moment, I'm still giving reasons why I think the extreme view that we were only interested in inflation and oblivious to everything else is an oversimplification. But obviously we did look at other things. Whilst we were conscious of the need to capitalise on this once-in-a-decade opportunity to reduce inflation, we did not operate by any inflexible rule. For example, the first easings in monetary policy occurred in early 1990, in fact in January 1990, and they were taken before there was clear evidence that inflation had fallen. Forecasts were suggesting it was going to fall, but there wasn't really clear evidence. I have to concede, of course, that those forecasts that showed inflation would fall underestimated the extent to which it fell, but we were prepared to ease on the basis of what we thought would happen. We didn't completely wait to see the whites of the eyes. Now, in these easings that occurred during 1990 and for most of 1991, the main danger we faced in terms of public reaction was that we had gone too far. It may seem surprising today, but if you go back and look at the press at the time, the predominant reaction from financial, economic and political journalists and the various pundits from financial markets was that the reductions in interest rates were premature and they were risky or they were politically motivated. I've gone back and looked at it. I mean, I remembered it, but I've also gone back and looked at it, and it is surprising. Even through until as recently as some of the reductions in late 1991. As I said before, hinted at before, we were not prepared to force the pace of reduction too much and end up with a major adverse reaction in financial markets. But on the other hand, we weren't so cautious as to be afraid to take some calculated risks in this direction. A lot of people would maintain, and I think it's a reasonable thing to maintain, that the best measure of what's going to happen to inflation in the medium term is to look at what the level of bond yields is. The bond yields capture the inflationary expectations. Well, we actually started easing monetary policy. In fact, we eased monetary policy 5 times before we got any lead from the bond market in the form of falling bond yields. Bond yields in Australia did not really fall significantly until the September quarter 1991 CPI was received, which was actually during the December quarter of 1990, until the September quarter of 1990 CPI was received. So the bond market didn't really perceive that that there was a likelihood of a significant fall in inflation really until the end of 1990. And if we had been extremely cautious, or if we had have had some sort of rigid rule, we may well have waited until then before we could be absolutely confident that it was safe to ease monetary policy because inflation was falling. But we were prepared to take the sort of calculated risk of moving earlier than that. Similarly, in the mid-1991, the yield curve, I hope I'm not getting too technical here, the difference between short-term and long-term interest rates was flat. A lot of people and a lot of approaches to monetary policy would say that once it becomes flat, if you ease any further and it becomes upward sloping, then you're being very expansionary, and how could you be taken seriously as someone who wants to reduce inflation if you would ease monetary policy in those circumstances. Well, the long and the short of it was we did go ahead and ease in those circumstances. So can I conclude on the monetary policy thing by saying that in an open economy with a free domestic and international capital markets, which is what we've got, the financial markets themselves set a corridor within which monetary policy can act. In the current phase of the cycle, too rapid an easing of monetary policy would risk problems with the currency, i.e. the currency collapsing. A couple of times it looked as though it might, a couple of times it did briefly. And also, if the financial markets perceived you'd gone too far, then bond yields could actually rise. If the financial markets thought that you're easing too quickly and that down the track you were going to push up inflation, then bond yields would actually rise. So there certainly is a pace of easing which would be totally counterproductive in that it would probably give you a currency crisis and would cause your long-term interest rates to in fact rise. So that there is a limit that the financial markets place on you there. And if either of those two things occurred, I think not only would you not achieve any of your medium-term aims in terms of lower inflation, sustainably lower inflation, you would probably breed an environment of such uncertainty that business and consumer confidence would go to pieces anyhow. Nothing worse than getting up each morning and seeing on the front page of the paper how far the exchange rate's fallen the previous day, or how far bond yields have gone up. Not that that usually gets on the front page of the paper. So that's one side of the corridor. The discipline imposed on you, which you have to be sensitive to, so that you don't move too fast. On the other hand, had we been rigidly adhering to a policy which involved taking no risks at all of being ahead of the market, well, I think we would still have achieved, in fact we would certainly have achieved a major reduction in inflation, but at a higher cost than the significant one that we have already paid. So I think I will end at that point, and I'm happy to answer any questions of clarification that come from the talk, or any other questions that you may feel are relevant to the subjects discussed. Thank you very much. Well, I think I tried to get the point across through the whole period that we were conscious of how financial markets would react, and of course the foreign exchange market is probably the most important of the financial markets. So throughout the period, that was always a consideration. I mean, some people have said, to caricature it, some people have said there's been a gross error of monetary policy. As soon as you knew a recession was going to happen, why didn't you just get out there and ease completely? You know, you've eased, you've taken interest rates, short-term interest rates down a significant amount over a 2-year period. Why didn't you do it all at once? Surely that would have been forward-looking monetary policy. You know, policymakers are always too slow and they're too cautious. Should have done it all at once. Well, the answer is, I think quite clearly, if you had done it all at once, you would have got an absolute bloodbath on the currency market. Said probably also in the bond markets. You would have engendered so much uncertainty that not only would you have thrown your inflation aims away, that you would have given the impression, and correctly given the impression, to the community that you didn't know what you were doing, that you'd panicked. And so throughout the whole period, the pace at which you can legitimately ease is influenced by not only your assessment, probably, of prospective inflation, inflationary expectations, domestic excess demand, not only your assessment, but the market's assessments too. I think the market is flexible enough to know that there can be differing assessments, but they cannot be hugely differing. If you had come to the view in the middle of 1989, for example, and made a huge, sudden movement, a sudden easing of monetary policy, I suspect it's highly unlikely that you would have come to that view. Certainly people weren't saying that at the time, but if you had, it would almost certainly have been totally destabilising. You wouldn't have achieved any of your objectives. No, I don't think it's. I mean, the markets have been very unsettled in the last, the last 2 weeks. That's certainly true. The markets were actually. There are a few other times when they've been unsettled. They were unsettled right at the beginning. In the first easing in January 1990, the exchange rate dropped quite a bit, and again in January 1992. I think there's always been. They have always been sensitive to what sort of monetary policy was going to be pursued, but if they thought that it was not a totally unreasonable monetary policy, they would take it in their stride. But in any cycle, in any movement, you'll get closer to a point where if you've come down a long way, you get closer to a point where the likelihood of further moves in that direction diminishes, where the market expects that they would diminish. Well, yes, it goes without saying. I think it goes without saying that if you were coming off a level of 18%, there was a lot of room below that, and with every movement that you go down, the likelihood of further ones are reduced. Sorry.
Apropos this corridor that the market's set.
But by the way, when people are asking questions, could members of the press identify that they are members of the press? Are you a member of the press? Yeah. Right. Yep.
Apropos of this corridor that, apropos of this corridor that the market's
Yes.
set to operate within, we are seeing a bit of currency weakness at the moment, and we are seeing an increase in interest rates. If that is not the sign that maybe you've gone too far to permanent sign, to what do you attribute the recent currency moves?
I think some people have become accustomed to a state of affairs where they think it's normal for the bill yield to be below the cash rate, because it has been for quite a lot of that time over the last 2 years. And what in fact we're seeing at the moment is in many ways a return to a more normal configuration where bill and T-note yields would be expected to be a little bit higher than the cash rate. I think we're seeing something that's more like a return to normal. I'm not sure what the question is on the currency front.
To what do you attribute the recent weakness in currency?
Well, we could go on a long dissertation on that. I think when we say the recent, if we're referring to the last couple of days, I think international events would have a very big role to play in that. And if we talk about the last year, I think what we're talking about is, I think we have explained it in other places, that essentially during the period where monetary policy had to be extremely tight to try and get inflation down, we had the same experience that every other country's had that has been through that experience, which is not only do you have very high nominal and real interest rates, you end up having a rise in your real exchange rate, a temporary rise in the real exchange rate whilst that process of getting inflation down occurs. And I think we accepted, and I think a lot of people in the community accepted that that sort of very high real exchange rate in 1989 or so would be temporary, and in the fullness of time it would come down. And it's come down the right way. I mean, some people at that time were trying to encourage us to push it down, which I think is entirely the wrong way of doing things. I think the right way of doing things is to wait until inflation itself has come down, and then when inflation itself has come down, nominal interest rates can come down, and in that process you probably expect some of the temporary high real exchange rate to go away, and that's what we've seen happen over the last 14 or 15 months. I think that's entirely normal behaviour. We've seen it in New Zealand, we've seen it in Canada, we've seen it in a number of other countries. I think, can I go start at the right?
Ian Mannix from Radio National's Day Rate program. You've talked about the business cycle, but what about the political cycle? And would your decision have been changed if John Hewson had been in power and given you more so-called independence?
You won't be surprised to hear that I'm not going to answer that question. But you in answer to the first part, when I said the financial markets set a corridor, it doesn't mean you can't violate that corridor. It just says that the consequences of violating it would be very severe. We could have gone ahead and, as I said at one stage, reduced cash rates dramatically. You can do it, but the consequences would be unfortunate. The second point is, isn't that corridor to some extent contingent upon the market's assessment of where they think you are going? I think the answer to that is yes, it is. I think that if you are more credible, you get more leeway. I think, for example, one of the reasons why that bond rate stayed up so stubbornly for the first 9 or 10 months of 1990 probably was that the participants in the bond market didn't think that we were doing the right thing. They saw that we were easing and they weren't confident that it was the right long-term decision. And in that sense, we probably it probably made it more difficult for us. And I think that it is true that you earn your points if you can do what we have done, and if people see that inflation has come down and that we didn't panic or we haven't set ourselves an unrealistically ambitious target for various economic variables. I think we do get more leeway, more room in which to operate. But I don't think that this can be achieved very quickly. I think you have to actually have the runs on the board, the evidence that you can get inflation down and keep it down. And then I think that, for example, bond markets and foreign currency markets will probably give you more of the benefit of the doubt than we would have got through 1990 and 1991. Richard?
I'm representing a President and Western John Stan. If I may summarise much of the paper, I think something like this. In terms of reduced real output, we're not really out of step with much out of step with the rest of the OECD. In terms of increased unemployment, we are, but that is largely because of the restructuring that's going on and the pressures to internationalise. Pressures that are much greater than just the tariff reduction.
Yes.
In terms of reduced inflation, we've recently had a very good performance. So that given where we started from, we've done about as well as we can possibly do. And given that we've got 10% unemployment, what do we do now?
All right. Well, can I say a few words about your summary of the paper? It was not a bad summary. 8 out of 10. I'll give, this is my old professor I'm speaking to at the moment. The observations of the output were correct, I think, but it's also true for employment. If you look at the fall in output, there's half a dozen countries that had bigger falls in output in this cycle than us, and if you look at the falls in employment, it's also true. I haven't got that in there, but if you look at the employment, which is surprising in a way, given these structural things are happening. In some sense, it's surprising that there wasn't a bigger fall in employment. If you then switch, right, well, if you switch from employment to unemployment, the picture gets much more clouded, because unemployment is always a much more complicated concept. Because employment, you can sort of count how many jobs were lost. You can see how employment falls, whereas unemployment, you're relying on surveys, you're relying on people saying that they're looking for a job, and you can get some very strange results with unemployment. But certainly with output and with employment, I think the summary is correct, that we do tend to, I think, look at ourselves and think we've done uniquely badly. We don't have a broad enough perspective, and if we look around, we see, I think, for example, that all the countries that significantly reduced their inflation rates had substantial falls in output and employment, and including some countries that didn't reduce their inflation rate also had significant falls in output and employment, the UK being the classic example, although I think ultimately its inflation rate will come down, but at the moment it's no lower than it was 4 or 5 years ago. The other issue is, what do you do in an economy where these structural changes to employment are going on, where older ways of doing things are changing, where it's not just, as you say, it's not just tariffs, it's not just the traded goods sector, it's also true in the non-traded sector, it's true in the public sector, that everyone has realised that you can only really become wealthier as a country if you become more productive, and you can't continue with the old management and labour practices unless you put a brick wall around the country. And we've seen some countries that have gone down that path, and we've seen how disastrous it is. So what do you do? Well, I think that's the first thing, is that you don't try and ossify anything. I don't think, even in the short run, if you were worried about some industry contracting, I don't think you improve your medium-term chances of employing people by propping it up, by preventing it competing with other industries in other countries. We have many examples in Australia of industries that have actually done remarkably well by world standards. We have, it's often mentioned the recent growth, the growth over 5 years in non-traditional exports, for example, manufactured exports. Even the elaborately transformed manufactured exports has been quite impressive. We have all sorts of small industries, like the wine industry, the cotton industry. There's all sorts of industries that have come up from almost nowhere and as exporters and done remarkably well. So I don't think the answer is to turn the clock back. On the other hand, I don't think, well, I think that when the economy resumes reasonable growth, which it will, it's a matter of, we can argue about exactly when that will be, but when it resumes reasonable growth, we will see employment pick up and we will see the unemployment rate start to come down. Now, how far it comes down, I don't know. So probably the most useful thing we can do is set the macroeconomic conditions in place for sustained growth, although not necessarily maximum growth, but sustained growth in output, and that will achieve something. Now, beyond that, I think macroeconomic policies haven't got a huge role to play. I don't think we can say unemployment is higher than we would like, so let's ease monetary policy and get things growing as fast as possible, as soon as possible. I think that would be totally counterproductive. I think a lot of countries went through that episode in the late 60s and through the 70s. I think what we're interested in is sustainable growth. And I think the other things we have to do beyond that is a lot of things on the microeconomic side which enable new industries to develop and also enable members of the workforce to gain the sort of skills that will make them employable. I think really what we're seeing, not just in this country but in the world at the moment, is a huge oversupply of unskilled labour. I think when the economy picks up and starts to grow again, I think the skilled labour will probably be absorbed without too much difficulty, but we probably will, if we're going to have a big pool of unskilled labour, if we're going to produce a lot of entrants into the workforce who are unskilled, I think we're going to have unemployment problems that will last a lot longer than we would like. But I think there's a limit to what you can do with macroeconomic policy. I think you would agree that all macroeconomic policy can ever do, if there's a situation where one factor of production is an oversupply, all it can do is just get sustainable growth. The rest of it has to be done at the microeconomic and labour market level.
Now, I was wondering if you can clearly outline what the Reserve Bank's policy has been in intervening in the currency market in the past 2 weeks. I speak to people in those markets and they say that they expect the Reserve to perhaps create a floor under the market and smooth the process. Yet, last week, we actually drove the dollar up 140 basis points, which put it up 40 basis points above where it was at the start of the day. I wonder if you could also, in answering this question, perhaps put a figure on how much you've spent in the past 2 weeks.
Foreign exchange intervention is to some extent a cat and mouse game, and to a large extent, if the market is under extreme pressure to move in a particular direction on the basis of no recent news, and we wish to be effective, what we have to convince the market is that we're serious. And to convince the market that you're serious, you sometimes have to do things in a rather blunt heavy-handed way for a short period. So there's nothing unusual about intervention of that nature. In fact, I think the experience in other countries is that that is the most effective and the most economical form of intervention. So I'll leave my answer at that. I don't know the answer to the first, how much stimulation the economy would get from a lower dollar. I think I'm not even sure that it's the sort of question I would want to bend my mind to answering. I think I have already outlined how we have seen the movements in the Australian dollar over the last few years. The second question is, to what extent does a fall in the dollar impact on future inflation? Well, obviously there is an impact there. You can do all sorts of mechanical rules of thumb on what proportion, what the pass-through is, and we have got various models that do this, and we've published articles on the subject. Not sure that we're as confident that we know the answer about it as some of the people who read the articles, but I mean, the general proposition is that whilst it was inevitable that there would be some fall in the value of the Australian dollar from the very high temporary levels it reached a few years ago, there is also only so much that you can comfortably digest without prejudicing your medium-term inflation objectives. And that is a consideration that we certainly do bear in mind. The exchange rate has gone down 15% or so over the last year in trade-weighted terms. Now, that's not something to throw your hands up in horror about. It's not something to jump for joy about either. I think it's just really the way the market operates. I think there's a very big difference in having an exchange rate fall in that manner if it's falling, as I say, from a temporarily high level, and if it was falling against a background of interest rates that have been lowered because inflation has been lowered. And one of the attractions for some people of low inflation is that even when the exchange rate is not moving in either direction, you are actually making sort of creeping gains on competitiveness. That has, in Australia, I think we have become accustomed because of the experience of high inflation during the 70s and the 80s, and the experience of a generally declining exchange rate, to sort of regard it almost as our fate that we're sort of continuously losing competitiveness. That's not the case. It's certainly not the case once you've got a low rate of inflation lower than your trading partners. In the absence of anything happening on the exchange rate, you're actually getting some creeping advantage. It's one of the arguments for turning our back on the 70s and 80s and aiming at maintaining low inflation during the 90s. Certainly conscious of how much of an exchange rate change can be digested.
I'm not going to ask a question on exchange rate. Could you tell me what, we've got very low inflation now, could you tell me what level of inflation we have to rise to now to become unacceptable from the
the Reserve Bank's point of view? And that's the first question. And you can just give me a rate if you like. The second one is the timing or the lags on monetary policy is quite interesting in Richard words, and I think you've written and other people have written about factors which have slowed the lag or increased the lags during this cycle as to why it might be slower to indicate the debt, for example. I just wonder, looking forward, can you see factors which may change the lags on which monetary policy might operate in the next sort of upswing of the economy that we're looking at over the next couple of years?
I'm not sure that it's a truism to say monetary policy has long and variable lags, but I'm not even sure whether that's really correct. That was a statement that was made by Friedman, and he was referring to the variation between changes in the money supply and changes in nominal spending. And it's often translated and it's used to describe very different things. I think in the Australian case, the usual mistake or the biggest difficulty with monetary policy is not so much that the lags are longer than you think, but that you underestimate or you don't have a good enough assessment of what is already happening in the economy, how much expansion or how much contraction is already built into the economy. For example, in 1988, I think the argument there was not that the tightening of monetary policy took too long to operate. I think the argument was that the growth of the economy was much more robust than any of us knew at that time. And so the timely administration of a dose of monetary tightening was not as effective as it should have been because the dose was too small.
Or wasn't announced at the time, but I think that's certainly changed. It's discreet and announced, or it has been all the way down. I just wondered, the Reserve Bank is there to sort of set policy. It's got this sort of market corridor. Most of the markets are really looking, the long term now is sort of 3 months out for the markets. The Reserve Bank, in setting policy, obviously has to have a longer time frame in mind. I guess that's the sort of thing I'm interested in exploring. I mean, do you have that view that if you're so-called pulling the levers now, that you're going to be affecting activity or inflation down the track at what stage?
Yeah. Well, yes, we are. I mean, we're conscious of that. But the point I think that I want to make is that it's not that the lags changed, that they were longer than you thought. It's that the dosage that was applied was the wrong one. You should have applied more of it or less of it. Not that it took longer to work. I think that when I look back over the period, I think that is the difficulty with monetary policy. Not that you were confounded by the lags, but you were confounded by the fact that you weren't sure of how big a dose to give it. And someone mentioned it certainly does make it worse if there are circumstances where there are people going around the country denying that you've even administered a dose of it. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is that it's probably not a good time to be for me to be making public conjectures about that issue. I think all I'm saying is I think the reason I introduced that part was into the talk was really so I could talk about what I would term two nationally operating policies, saying that I don't think you could explain a regional problem by either of those two nationally operating policies. So I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room with fertile imaginations and a lot more familiarity with the subject than me, and I'm sure they can come up with any number of explanations.
Terry Macfarlane did have to go, and so it falls on me to thank Ian for his talk. He's more than fulfilled his contract to us. He's provided answers to most of your questions. At a time when we in Victoria are in the middle of elections and Queenslanders have been called to the polls, I can understand his reticence in not answering some questions. So Ian, I'd like to thank you very much for coming here to course today to give us this talk, and I ask you all to join me in thanking Ian in the usual way. Cause would like to invite you all to some drinks and something to eat out in the foyer. Thank you.